Early humans did not die young because their bodies were weak. In many ways, their bodies were stronger than ours. Their bones were denser, their muscles were tougher, and their senses were sharper. Yet most of them never reached old age. They survived hunger, cold, predators, and injury only to disappear long before their bodies truly failed. This creates a quiet paradox. A species physically adapted for endurance, but trapped inside lives that ended too soon. So the question is not why early humans died young, but why a body built to last was placed inside a life that could not. Early human life often appears short when measured by years, but this impression hides a deeper misunderstanding. A short life did not mean a weak body or a fragile design. In fact, the human body that emerged hundreds of thousands of years ago was shaped for resilience. Bones were thicker, muscles were conditioned by constant movement, and metabolism was tuned for scarcity rather than excess. These bodies were capable of enduring cold nights, long walks, and repeated physical stress without the modern comforts we rely on today. Yet despite this physical durability, most early humans disappeared from the world far earlier than we expect a strong body to fail. The key to this puzzle lies in separating the body from the life built around it. The human organism evolved slowly, across immense spans of time, optimizing survival traits that worked well in a dangerous landscape. But the daily conditions surrounding that body were relentlessly unstable. Life unfolded in environments where safety was never guaranteed, and where a single misstep could abruptly end everything. Strength mattered, but it could not compensate for constant exposure to risk. Early humans lived close to the edge of survival, not because they were poorly adapted, but because adaptation does not eliminate danger. It only increases the chance of passing through it. A body designed to run long distances and recover from strain still depends on continuity. When continuity breaks, strength becomes irrelevant. A fall during a hunt, a sudden illness, or an infected wound could interrupt a life that might otherwise have lasted decades longer. Longevity requires not just a durable body, but a stable world in which that body can keep functioning day after day. This distinction helps explain why the average length of early human life appears so low in archaeological records. These averages are not describing how long a healthy adult body could last under ideal conditions. They reflect how often lives were cut short by events that the body was never meant to fully control. Evolution favors traits that increase reproductive success, not traits that guarantee a peaceful old age. As long as an individual survived long enough to contribute to the next generation, natural selection had already done its work. From an evolutionary perspective, there was little pressure to extend life far beyond that point. A body that could survive into late adulthood was sufficient, even if few individuals ever reached that stage. This creates a quiet contradiction. The human body carried the potential for longer life, but the surrounding conditions rarely allowed that potential to unfold. Longevity existed as a possibility, not as a common outcome. Seen this way, early human life was not short because humans were poorly built. It was short because the world they inhabited offered no margin for error. Survival depended on constant engagement with uncertainty. Food sources shifted, climates changed, and dangers appeared without warning. In such a setting, life expectancy becomes a measure of environmental risk rather than biological limit. Understanding this helps ground the larger question of early human mortality in reality rather than myth. The past was not a time of inherently fragile people, but of fragile lives. Bodies endured, but lives were repeatedly interrupted. This difference matters because it reminds us that longevity is not only a biological achievement, it is also a social and environmental one, built slowly through reduced risk rather than increased strength. If the early human body was capable of endurance, the next question is, what kind of life that body was placed into each day? Daily existence unfolded without layers of protection. There were no stable shelters that could fully separate people from weather, no stored reserves that could guarantee tomorrow's meals, and no predictable routines that reduced exposure to danger. Life was organized around constant movement through landscapes that demanded attention at every step. Each decision carried weight because mistakes were rarely reversible. A strong body could walk far, lift heavy loads, and tolerate pain, but it could not pause the world long enough to recover safely. Survival depended on remaining alert and mobile, often for years at a time, without interruption. In such conditions, life expectancy becomes less about how long a body can last, and more about how long chance allows it to continue uninterrupted. Early human groups lived with a continuous background level of risk that modern life rarely reproduces. Water sources could dry up, animals could migrate away, and seasonal changes could arrive earlier or harsher than expected. The body evolved to adapt to variability, but variability itself increases exposure to danger. A long life requires consistency. While early human environments were defined by fluctuation, even when food was available and bodies were healthy, the future remained uncertain. This uncertainty was not occasional, it was constant. Over decades, constant risk compounds. The longer a person lives under such conditions, the more opportunities there are for something to go wrong. This helps explain why many early human lives ended abruptly rather than gradually. Aging was not always the primary force shaping mortality. Instead, death often arrived through interruption. An injury that would be manageable today could become fatal without time and safety for healing. Illnesses that modern immune systems can overcome with rest and nutrition had fewer such supports in the past. The body's capacity to recover exists only when the surrounding environment allows recovery to happen. Without that allowance, resilience reaches its limit quickly. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern reveals an important truth. Evolution shaped bodies for efficiency under pressure, not for comfort or security. Muscles, bones, and energy systems adapted to movement and scarcity, but they were not designed to eliminate risk. They were designed to respond to it. Over time, this produced a species that could survive in many environments, but not one that could neutralize danger entirely. Longevity remained fragile, because it depended on factors outside the body itself. This distinction matters when interpreting ancient lifespans. When archaeologists estimate early human life expectancy, they are measuring the outcome of repeated exposure to hazard, not the expiration date of the human body. A short average lifespan does not imply that bodies were incapable of living longer. It reflects how often lives were interrupted before reaching that potential. The environment set the terms, and biology responded within those limits. By grounding early human mortality in daily conditions rather than biological weakness, a clearer picture emerges. The human body carried unused capacity, shaped by evolution but constrained by circumstance. Long life was possible, but rare, not because bodies failed early, but because the world offered little space for long, uninterrupted survival. This understanding shifts the question away from how humans were built and toward how they lived, setting the stage for examining which moments in life carried the greatest risk of being cut short. When all of this is considered together, the shortness of early human life begins to look less like a biological failure and more like a statistical illusion created by constant exposure to interruption. The human body carried a design that could, under stable conditions, last far longer than most early humans ever experienced. But stability itself was rare. Lives were shaped not by slow decline, but by sudden endings layered one on top of another across a population. When many lives end early for external reasons, the average collapses, even if some individuals quietly lived much longer than the number suggests. In this way, early human life expectancy tells us more about danger than about aging. This distinction becomes clearer when imagining a person who survives long enough for the body's deeper limits to appear. Such individuals did exist. Skeletal evidence shows signs of healed fractures, worn joints, and long-term survival after serious injury. These traces suggest that when chance allowed continuity, the human body often endured. Aging did not immediately lead to collapse. Instead, the body continued functioning until something external intervened. Old age was possible, but it was statistically drowned out by the sheer frequency of earlier interruptions. What makes this important is that evolution does not design for averages. It designs for possibilities that are good enough to pass genes forward. Once that threshold is reached, the rest of life unfolds largely outside the reach of natural selection. Early humans reached reproductive age under harsh conditions, and many succeeded in reproducing. Beyond that point, whether a life continued for 10 more years or 30 more years mattered little to evolutionary outcomes. There was no strong pressure to remove the dangers that shortened life, because those dangers did not prevent reproduction from occurring in the first place. This creates a quiet mismatch between potential and reality. The body held more life than the environment usually permitted. Over time, this mismatch became normalized. Short lives did not signal a flawed design. They signaled a world where design alone could not guarantee survival. In such a setting, longevity was not a trait that could reliably express itself across generations. It appeared occasionally, then vanished again, shaped by luck as much as by strength. Understanding this helps correct a common assumption about the past. Early humans were not living brief lives because their bodies aged faster than ours. They were living brief lives because aging was rarely given the time to fully unfold. Death often arrived long before the slow processes of decline became relevant. The body's internal clock was frequently silenced by events outside the body entirely. This perspective also explains why increases in human lifespan did not begin with stronger bodies, but with changes that reduced interruption. When risk decreases, potential has room to express itself. Longevity emerges not because biology suddenly improves, but because life stops being cut short so often. The seeds of long life were present early on, waiting for conditions that could support them. By the end of this line of thought, the question shifts subtly. The mystery is no longer why early humans died young, but why dying young became so common in the first place. The answer points away from anatomy and toward the structure of life itself, preparing the ground for a closer look at which stages of life were most vulnerable to being abruptly ended. The most dangerous period in early human life was not old age, but the very beginning. Childhood carried risks so high that simply surviving the first years of life dramatically changed one's chances of living longer. This reality quietly shapes every calculation of early human lifespan. When many lives end before reaching maturity, the average shortens sharply, even if adult bodies are capable of lasting far longer. Early human infants entered a world where survival was never guaranteed, and where small vulnerabilities carried enormous consequences. Birth itself was hazardous, followed by a long period of complete dependence. A child's body was not yet strong, its immune system still developing, and its ability to regulate temperature, nutrition, and injury extremely limited. In an environment without stable shelter, consistent food, or medical knowledge, these early weaknesses mattered far more than later strength. The human body may have been built for endurance, but endurance only begins to matter after survival has already been secured. For early human groups, raising children was a biological challenge under constant pressure. Mothers faced physical strain from pregnancy and nursing while continuing to gather food and move with the group. Infants depended entirely on adult care for warmth, nourishment, and protection. Even minor disruptions could prove fatal. A temporary shortage of food, an unusually cold season, or a minor infection could end a young life before it had truly begun. Unlike adults, children had little margin for error. Their survival depended not only on their own biology, but on the continuous functioning of the group around them. This vulnerability explains why early human populations experienced extremely high child mortality. Many children did not live long enough to be counted as part of adult life at all. When archaeologists reconstruct life expectancy, these early deaths weigh heavily on the numbers. A population in which half of all children die young will always appear short-lived, even if those who survive childhood often live for decades afterward. The body's long-term potential becomes statistically invisible when early interruption is so common. From an evolutionary standpoint, this pattern shaped how human life unfolded. Natural selection favored traits that increased the likelihood of surviving childhood just long enough to reproduce, not traits that guaranteed safety during infancy. Evolution cannot eliminate all risk, it can only adjust probabilities. Human children remain vulnerable because the cost of eliminating that vulnerability was too high. A longer childhood allowed for brain development, learning, and social bonding, but it also extended the period of dependence and danger. This trade-off became a defining feature of human life. Once childhood was survived, the structure of life changed. The body strengthened, skills accumulated, and social roles became more stable. Survival odds improved not because danger disappeared, but because resilience increased. This creates a sharp contrast within early human life. The first years were fragile and uncertain, while later years often showed surprising durability. Many adults who reached maturity lived long enough to experience aging, injury recovery, and extended participation in group life. Their existence challenges the idea that early humans were biologically short-lived. Understanding this imbalance reframes the meaning of early human mortality. Short life expectancy does not describe how long a typical adult lived. It describes how many lives were lost before adulthood ever began. Childhood functioned as a severe filter, shaping populations through loss rather than decline. The danger was front-loaded at the beginning of life, not spread evenly across it. This insight draws attention away from aging itself and toward the earliest stage of human existence. It suggests that to understand why early human life was so short, we must first understand why so many lives ended before they had the chance to unfold at all. Childhood was not simply a phase of growth. It was the most perilous threshold a human life had to cross. Childhood risk did not end at birth but stretched across many vulnerable years, in which survival depended on uninterrupted care and stable conditions that rarely existed. Early human children grew slowly, both physically and neurologically, compared to other mammals, which meant a long period of dependence on adults for food, warmth, and protection. This extended childhood was an evolutionary investment in learning, social bonding, and brain development. But it also came with a heavy cost. The longer a child remained dependent, the longer that child remained exposed to danger. A brief illness, a failed hunt, or the loss of a caregiver could turn dependency into fatal vulnerability. In a world without surplus or safety nets, there was little room to absorb such shocks. The environment amplified these risks in subtle ways. Seasonal changes affected food availability, and young bodies were less capable of enduring hunger or nutritional imbalance. Temperature regulation was fragile, making cold nights or sudden weather shifts especially dangerous. Mobility limitations meant that children could not easily escape threats or adapt quickly to changing conditions. Even when adults were skilled and attentive, the margin between survival and loss remained thin. Childhood survival was not a steady climb toward safety, but a prolonged negotiation with uncertainty. Social structure offered some protection, but it was not absolute. Early human groups were small, and each member carried multiple responsibilities essential to survival. Care was often shared, yet resources were finite. When groups faced stress, trade-offs became unavoidable. Supporting a dependent child required energy that might otherwise sustain the group as a whole. These pressures did not arise from indifference, but from ecological constraint. Under such conditions, not all lives could be equally protected at all times. Over generations, this pattern shaped population dynamics. Many children were born, but fewer reached adulthood. This was not a sign of reproductive failure, but an expected outcome of life in high-risk environments. Evolution accommodated this loss by favoring higher birth rates rather than guaranteed survival. Human life expanded at the beginning to compensate for narrowing later. The result was a population structure in which early loss was common and adult survival, once achieved, appeared relatively robust. This imbalance distorts modern interpretations of early human lifespan. When childhood mortality is included, life expectancy drops sharply. When it is excluded, a different picture emerges, one in which adults often lived long enough to accumulate experience, knowledge, and social influence. The shortness of early human life, then, is not evenly distributed across the lifespan. It is concentrated at the start, where fragility is highest and protection is hardest to maintain. Recognizing this helps clarify why early humans could appear both short-lived and resilient at the same time. The same population could produce individuals who died in infancy and others who lived into later adulthood. These outcomes were not contradictory, they were two expressions of the same ecological reality. Childhood functioned as a prolonged filter, shaping who would carry life forward and who would be lost along the way. By focusing on this extended vulnerability, the question of early human life becomes more precise. The issue is not simply that lives were short, but that survival demanded passing through a long, exposed beginning. Only after that passage did the strengths of the human body fully matter. Surviving childhood did more than keep a young human alive. It fundamentally reshaped the meaning of life expectancy in early populations. Once a child passed the most vulnerable years, the the probability of living much longer increased sharply. This is why early human life appears paradoxical when viewed through averages alone. The same population that lost many children early could also sustain adults for long spans of time. After childhood, bodies strengthened, immune responses matured, and experience accumulated, allowing individuals to navigate risks more effectively. Knowledge of landscapes, seasons, and social relationships reduced exposure to danger, not by eliminating it, but by managing it more skillfully. At this stage, the human body's resilience finally had room to express itself. Injuries were more likely to heal, hunger could be endured longer, and threats were more often anticipated rather than encountered blindly. This transition created a sharp divide within early human life. Before it, survival depended heavily on others and on fragile biological systems still under construction. After it, survival became more individual, more skill-based, and more stable even within a dangerous world. This divide explains why early humans could accumulate elders with deep knowledge despite having short average lifespans. Those elders were statistical survivors, not biological anomalies. Their existence was the result of passing through an intense early filter, not of possessing fundamentally different bodies. Over time, these survivors played important roles within their groups, contributing memory, decision-making, and social continuity. Their presence shows that early human life was not uniformly brief, but unevenly distributed, shaped by loss at the beginning rather than collapse at the end. When modern observers describe early human life as short, they often imagine a gradual decline ending early, but the reality was closer to a sharp cliff followed by a long plateau. Many lives ended before maturity, while those that did not often unfolded across many years. This pattern makes childhood the key to understanding early human mortality. It was not merely a stage of growth, but the primary gate through which longevity had to pass. Once through that gate, the human body often proved capable of lasting far longer than the numbers suggest. Injury was a constant companion in early human life, not as a rare accident, but as a routine consequence of daily survival. Hunting, gathering, climbing, carrying, and traveling across uneven terrain placed the body under continual physical strain. Small wounds were unavoidable, and larger injuries were always a possibility. What made these injuries so dangerous was not their frequency, but the lack of conditions required for recovery. The human body possesses remarkable healing capacity, but healing is a slow process that depends on rest, cleanliness, nutrition, and safety. Early human life offered very little of any of these. A twisted ankle, a deep cut, or a fractured bone did not merely cause pain, it threatened the continuity of life itself. Without the ability to pause safely, even minor injuries could cascade into fatal outcomes. The problem was not that early humans lacked resilience, but that resilience requires time. A wound must be kept clean to avoid infection, yet exposure to dirt, animal matter, and untreated water made contamination almost inevitable. A broken limb must be immobilized, yet daily movement was essential for acquiring food and maintaining group mobility. Rest reduces strain and allows tissue to repair, but rest was a luxury rarely available for long. The body might be capable of healing, but the surrounding conditions actively interfered with that process. Recovery was always competing with survival demands. This tension created a dangerous threshold. As long as an injured person could still contribute, even partially, survival remained possible. Once injury crossed a certain point, however, the balance collapsed. An individual who could no longer walk efficiently, hunt effectively, or gather reliably became more vulnerable not only to the environment but to time itself. Energy reserves dwindled, exposure increased, and the risk of secondary complications rose sharply. What might have been a survivable injury under stable conditions became lethal through accumulation rather than severity. Archaeological evidence shows both sides of this reality. Some skeletal remains display healed fractures and long-term adaptations to injury, indicating that care, cooperation, and endurance did sometimes allow recovery. These cases demonstrate that early humans were capable of supporting injured individuals for extended periods, but such recoveries required a rare alignment of factors: sufficient food, group stability, and an injury that did not completely eliminate mobility. For every healed fracture preserved in bone, countless others likely ended lives before healing could leave a trace. From an evolutionary perspective, this pattern reveals another reason early human life was often short. Injury was not merely a momentary threat, it was a prolonged vulnerability. Each day an injury remained unresolved increased the chance of infection, starvation, or exposure. Death did not arrive instantly, but accumulated quietly as recovery failed to keep pace with necessity. Life expectancy was shaped not only by catastrophic events, but by the slow erosion of survival capacity following injury. This helps explain why early human mortality often appears abrupt rather than gradual. Aging was not required to bring life to an end. A single misstep could initiate a chain of events that the body alone could not reverse. The environment did not need to be hostile in a dramatic sense. It only needed to be indifferent to recovery. In such a world, the difference between survival and death was often measured not in strength, but in uninterrupted time. Understanding injury in this context shifts the focus away from physical robustness and toward ecological constraint. The early human body was not fragile, but it was constantly exposed to situations that denied it the conditions needed to heal. Life was shortened not because bodies failed quickly, but because injuries were rarely given the chance to fully resolve. This persistent vulnerability set the stage for understanding how infection and disease further magnified the cost of even the smallest wounds, deepening the risks that shaped early human survival. Infection turned ordinary injury into one of the most decisive forces shaping early human mortality, not because disease was new, but because it was unmanaged. Long before humans understood germs, bacteria were already part of every wound, every scrape, and every cut. The immune system could fight many of these invasions, but its success depended on conditions that were rarely met. Clean water, sterile surfaces, and prolonged rest were not available. A wound exposed to soil, animal blood, or untreated tools became a gateway through which infection could enter the body and slowly overwhelm it. What begins as a minor injury could quietly transform into a systemic threat over days or weeks, long after the initial pain had faded. In this way, death often arrived not as a sudden event, but as the delayed consequence of something that once seemed survivable. Early human environments intensified this danger through constant exposure. Daily activities brought people into close contact with animal remains, decaying matter, and contaminated water sources. Cuts acquired during hunting or food preparation were immediately exposed to bacteria without any means of disinfection. The immune response itself required energy, nutrition, and rest, all of which were limited. When the body diverted energy toward fighting infection, less remained for movement, thermoregulation, and food acquisition. This trade-off weakened the injured individual further, increasing vulnerability to starvation and exposure. Infection thus operated not only as a direct killer, but as a force that steadily eroded overall survival capacity. The slow nature of many infections made them especially dangerous. Unlike catastrophic injuries that ended life quickly, infections lingered. Fever drained energy, pain reduced mobility, and swelling limited function. Over time, these effects compounded. An infected foot slowed travel, leading to missed meals. Missed meals weakened immunity, allowing infection to spread further. This feedback loop required no dramatic event to become fatal. It only required time without recovery. The longer an infection persisted, the more it narrowed the margin between life and death. Evidence from skeletal remains suggests that some infections were survived, leaving marks of bone inflammation or healing. These cases show that early humans were not defenseless. Care from others, favorable conditions, and strong immune responses sometimes allowed recovery, but survival from infection was inconsistent and unpredictable. Many infections leave no trace on bone because death occurs before healing can register archaeologically. This absence of evidence masks the scale of loss. For every visible sign of survival, there were likely many unseen deaths that left no durable record. From an evolutionary perspective, infection did not exert strong selective pressure to eliminate vulnerability because it often acted after reproduction had already occurred. Individuals who survived long enough to reproduce passed on their genes even if they later died from infection. As a result, susceptibility to infection remained part of the human condition. The body evolved defenses, but not guarantees. This again highlights why early human life could be both resilient and short. Bodies fought disease effectively enough to sustain populations, but not effectively enough to ensure long individual lives. The interaction between injury and infection created a fragile equilibrium. An uninfected injury might heal given time. An infection without injury might be resisted by a strong immune system. Together, they formed a persistent threat that slowly undermined survival. This combination explains why early human mortality often followed patterns of gradual decline rather than immediate collapse. Life was shortened not by dramatic failure, but by cumulative burden. Recognizing the role of infection clarifies why improvements in human lifespan later depended so heavily on reducing disease exposure rather than altering the body itself. Long before medicine extended life, it was the control of infection that allowed injuries to stop being fatal interruptions. In early human life, however, infection remained an ever-present force, silently shortening lives by denying the body the time it needed to heal. Injury and infection together created a pattern of mortality that rarely announced itself clearly in early human life. Death often emerged not from a single overwhelming cause, but from the slow accumulation of unresolved problems. A wound that did not fully heal, an infection that never entirely cleared, or a lingering weakness that reduced mobility could quietly narrow the range of possible futures. Each day, survival required effort, and any reduction in capacity made that effort harder to sustain. Over time, this gradual erosion mattered more than dramatic events. Life ended not because the body suddenly failed, but because it was steadily denied the conditions needed to return to balance. This cumulative process explains why early human deaths often lacked a clear boundary between health and collapse. People did not always transition from strength to weakness in a straight line. Instead, they moved back and forth between partial recovery and renewed strain. An individual might survive an injury only to be weakened enough that a later illness became fatal. Another might overcome infection, but with reduced strength that increased vulnerability to cold or hunger. Survival depended on maintaining a delicate equilibrium, and once that balance tipped, it was difficult to restore. The body's resilience was real, but it operated within narrow margins. From the perspective of daily life, this meant that time itself became an enemy. The longer a person lived under constant strain, the more opportunities there were for small setbacks to accumulate. Even without a single catastrophic event, the probability of eventual failure increased simply through exposure. Longevity required not just strength, but repeated success at avoiding interruption. Each year survived added value in experience, but it also added risk. This is why early human life expectancy remained low even when adults were capable of enduring hardship for long periods. Archaeological records rarely capture this slow decline. Bones preserve moments of healing or trauma, but they cannot show exhaustion, chronic infection, or diminished energy. Much of early human mortality occurred invisibly through processes that left little physical trace. As a result, the past can appear cleaner and simpler than it was. Behind each skeletal remain lies a complex history of effort, adaptation, and gradual loss that numbers alone cannot convey. This pattern also explains why early human groups relied so heavily on cooperation. Sharing food, protecting injured members, and maintaining social bonds were not moral luxuries, but survival strategies. Cooperation could slow the erosion caused by injury and infection, buying time for recovery. Yet cooperation itself had limits. Groups could not indefinitely support members who could no longer contribute, especially during periods of scarcity. When those limits were reached, the balance shifted again toward loss. Seen as a whole, injury and infection did not shorten early human life by overwhelming the body outright. They shortened it by interfering with continuity. Recovery required sustained stability, and stability was rare. Life expectancy therefore reflected how often recovery was interrupted rather than how quickly bodies wore out. The human organism carried the capacity to endure, but endurance alone could not guarantee long life without the environmental space to heal. By understanding mortality as a cumulative process rather than a sudden failure, the nature of early human life becomes clearer. Lives were shortened not by inherent fragility, but by the repeated denial of uninterrupted time. This perspective prepares the ground for examining another force that quietly ended many lives, not through injury or disease, but through the fundamental challenge of sustaining energy itself. Hunger shaped early human life not as constant starvation, but as persistent instability in energy balance that quietly limited survival over time. Early humans often had enough to eat to stay alive, yet rarely enough to build reserves that could protect them when conditions shifted. Food availability followed cycles of abundance and scarcity tied to seasons, migrations, and climate fluctuations. During good periods, bodies recovered, strength returned, and groups functioned effectively. During lean periods, even if starvation did not occur, energy intake dropped below what was needed for full maintenance. This gap mattered more than dramatic famine. The human body can endure short-term shortages, but repeated deficits slowly erode resilience. Muscles weaken, immune responses falter, and recovery from injury slows. Life becomes more fragile not through collapse, but through gradual depletion. Unlike modern societies, early human groups had limited ability to store food across long periods. Preservation techniques were simple, and storage itself introduced risks of spoilage or loss. Mobility, which protected groups from local depletion, also prevented accumulation. Carrying surplus over long distances was costly and often impractical. As a result, survival depended on continual success rather than buffered security. Each day required fresh effort to replace expended energy. When that effort failed repeatedly, the body began operating below optimal levels, even if death from hunger never arrived. This instability affected different stages of life in different ways. Children and the elderly were most vulnerable, but adults were not immune. An adult weakened by repeated low intake became more susceptible to injury, infection, and exhaustion. Hunger did not need to kill directly to shorten life. It only needed to reduce the body's ability to respond to other threats. A minor wound heals more slowly when nutrition is inadequate. An infection becomes more dangerous when energy reserves are low. Cold is harder to tolerate when body fat and muscle mass decline. Hunger acted as a multiplier of risk rather than a single cause. From an evolutionary perspective, this pattern makes sense. Natural selection favored bodies that could survive fluctuation rather than bodies that required constant abundance. Humans evolved metabolic flexibility, the ability to shift energy use, conserve resources, and endure shortfalls. But flexibility has limits. It allows survival through instability, not immunity from its consequences. Over years and decades, repeated energy stress accumulates, increasing the probability that some other challenge will prove fatal. Archaeological evidence supports this view indirectly. Signs of periodic stress appear in growth patterns, dental markers, and skeletal indicators of nutritional strain. These do not always correspond to immediate death, but they reveal lives lived close to energetic margins. Early humans often survived hardship, but survival came at a cost that shortened the overall arc of life. Longevity requires not just survival, but sustained surplus that allows repair, recovery, and buffering against chance. That surplus was rare. This helps explain why early human life expectancy remained low, even in environments that were not permanently hostile. A landscape could be rich in resources and still produce short lives if those resources were unpredictable. Stability matters more than abundance. Without consistent energy, the body cannot fully invest in long-term maintenance. It prioritizes immediate survival over future durability. Aging accelerates not because time speeds up, but because repair falls behind wear. Understanding hunger in this way shifts the narrative away from dramatic images of famine and toward the quieter reality of energetic precarity. Early humans were not always starving, but they were rarely secure. Their lives were shaped by the constant need to balance effort and intake without margin for prolonged failure. This condition shortened life not by dramatic collapse, but by steadily narrowing the body's capacity to withstand the many other pressures of early human existence. Hunger interacted with every other risk in early human life by quietly lowering the threshold at which problems became fatal. When energy intake was inconsistent, the body was forced into constant trade-offs, diverting resources away from long-term maintenance toward immediate survival. This meant that processes like tissue repair, immune response, and thermoregulation were often underfunded. A body operating in energy deficit can still function, but it does so by postponing repair. Over time, postponed repair accumulates as weakness. Muscles lose strength, wounds close more slowly, and infections linger longer than they otherwise would. Hunger did not need to cause death directly to shorten life. It only needed to slow recovery enough for other threats to take over. In this way, energy instability acted as a silent partner to injury and disease, magnifying their impact without announcing itself as the primary cause. The effects of this instability were rarely uniform. Periods of adequate food could temporarily restore strength, creating cycles of decline and partial recovery. These cycles allowed survival to continue, but they also prevented the body from ever fully catching up. Each recovery began from a slightly lower baseline than the last. Over years, this pattern reduced resilience even in individuals who never experienced extreme starvation. The body endured, but it did so by consuming its own reserves, gradually narrowing the margin between functioning and failure. Life expectancy shortened not because bodies were incapable of lasting longer, but because maintenance was repeatedly interrupted. This energetic precarity also shaped behavior and decision-making. Early humans had to prioritize immediate food acquisition over rest, even when injured or ill. Skipping a day of foraging could mean hunger for the entire group. As a result, individuals often continued to exert themselves when recovery would have been safer. This choice was not reckless. It was necessary. Survival required movement, effort, and exposure, even when the body signaled the need to pause. Hunger thus enforced a rhythm of life that favored persistence over healing, keeping bodies in a state of ongoing strain. Children were especially affected by this dynamic. Growth requires surplus energy, and when surplus was intermittent, growth slowed or became uneven. This did not necessarily cause immediate death, but it increased vulnerability. A child weakened by repeated nutritional stress was less able to withstand infection, cold, or injury. Early setbacks carried forward, shaping the entire lifespan. Hunger, therefore, influenced mortality not only in the moment, but across years, by altering developmental trajectories in subtle but lasting ways. From an evolutionary perspective, this pattern again reveals why early human life could be short without implying biological inadequacy. Selection favored flexibility rather than abundance. Humans evolved to survive lean times, not to eliminate their cost. Energy instability remained embedded in daily life, and its cumulative effects went largely unchecked. Longevity requires sustained investment in repair, and sustained investment requires reliable surplus. In early human environments, surplus was temporary and unpredictable. This understanding reframes hunger as a chronic condition rather than an episodic crisis. Early humans were often nourished enough to survive, but rarely nourished enough to thrive continuously. Their bodies operated in a mode of endurance rather than renewal. Over time, endurance alone was not enough to preserve long life. Hunger shortened lives by slowly wearing down the systems that protect against injury, disease, and exhaustion, making death more likely from causes that might otherwise have been survived. Hunger did not end life suddenly for most early humans, but it quietly reshaped the entire rhythm of survival, turning time itself into a source of pressure. When energy intake was unpredictable, the body learned to operate in a state of constant calculation, balancing immediate needs against long-term maintenance. This calculation always favored the present. Muscles were used even when strained, injuries were tolerated even when unhealed, and illness was endured even when rest was needed. The body adapted to scarcity by conserving energy wherever possible, but conservation came at a cost. Processes that protect life over decades, such as tissue renewal, immune vigilance, and hormonal balance, were repeatedly delayed. Life continued, but it did so on borrowed strength. Over years, this pattern produced a subtle form of wear that differed from aging as we understand it today. It was not the slow accumulation of damage under stable conditions, but the repeated interruption of repair under unstable ones. Each period of low energy forced the body to pause its long-term work. When food returned, repair resumed, but rarely long enough to fully compensate. The result was a life lived in cycles of partial recovery, never reaching a true baseline of renewal. Longevity requires continuity, and hunger fractured that continuity again and again. This dynamic also shaped how early humans experienced effort. Physical work did not occur against a background of security, but against the awareness that failure carried immediate consequences. Effort could not be postponed. Even when exhausted or weakened, individuals had to continue moving, gathering, hunting, and protecting themselves. Hunger transformed effort from a choice into an obligation. The body might signal the need to slow down, but survival demanded persistence. Over time, this mismatch between bodily signals and environmental demands increased the likelihood of breakdown. Importantly, this form of energetic stress rarely appeared dramatic. There were no clear moments when hunger alone caused death. Instead, hunger reduced tolerance to everything else. Cold nights felt colder, infections lasted longer, injuries healed more slowly, fatigue accumulated more quickly. Each of these changes increased risk incrementally. Death arrived through a convergence of small disadvantages rather than a single overwhelming force. Life expectancy shortened because the margin for error narrowed with every cycle of scarcity. From an evolutionary perspective, this was not a flaw but an expected outcome. Natural selection favored individuals who could survive variable conditions long enough to reproduce, not those who could preserve their bodies indefinitely. Flexibility mattered more than durability. The human metabolism became skilled at enduring fluctuation, but not at eliminating its long-term cost. Energy instability remained embedded in daily life, shaping survival probabilities without ever becoming a discrete cause of death. This helps explain why early human populations could persist for thousands of years while individual lives remained relatively short. The system worked at the level of the group and the species, even as it extracted a toll from individuals. Hunger regulated population size indirectly by increasing mortality from other causes, maintaining balance with available resources. Longevity was sacrificed not through design, but through circumstance. Understanding hunger in this cumulative way reframes early human mortality once again. Lives were not shortened because people lacked food entirely, but because food rarely provided the stability needed for long-term bodily investment. Survival was achieved repeatedly, but renewal was postponed repeatedly as well. Over time, postponement became erosion. The human body endured, but endurance alone could not protect life indefinitely without the steady foundation of reliable energy. In this way, hunger shortened early human life not by taking it away outright, but by steadily limiting how long the body could keep giving. Pregnancy and childbirth represented one of the most significant and underappreciated risks in early human life, not because reproduction was rare, but because it was biologically demanding and ecologically unsupported. For early human women, bringing new life into the world occurred without medical knowledge, sanitation, or the ability to intervene when complications arose. The human body had already evolved toward a difficult compromise, a large-brained infant passing through a pelvis shaped for upright walking. This compromise made childbirth inherently risky even under ideal conditions. In early human environments, conditions were far from ideal. Labor took place without sterile tools, pain management, or skilled assistance beyond experiential knowledge passed through generations. A single complication could quickly become fatal for the mother, the infant, or both. Pregnancy itself placed prolonged strain on the body. Carrying a child increased energy requirements at a time when food availability was already unstable. Nutritional stress weakened the mother's reserves, reducing her ability to recover from blood loss, infection, or exhaustion during birth. The immune system was challenged by the physiological demands of pregnancy, increasing vulnerability to illness. These stresses did not disappear after delivery. Postpartum recovery required rest, warmth, and reliable nourishment. Yet early human life rarely allowed for extended recovery. Caring for an infant demanded immediate effort, even as the body remained vulnerable. Childbirth injuries were particularly dangerous. Tears, hemorrhage, and retained tissue could lead to infection in environments rich with bacteria and lacking any means of treatment. Even when death did not occur immediately, lingering complications could weaken the body over time, increasing susceptibility to other risks. A woman who survived childbirth might still face reduced strength, chronic pain, or infection that shortened her life later. Mortality connected to reproduction therefore extended beyond the moment of birth itself, contributing quietly to overall life expectancy. This reproductive risk shaped population patterns in subtle ways. High maternal mortality meant that many women died during their reproductive years, not in old age. Their deaths lowered average lifespan figures and disrupted family structures. Infants who lost their mothers faced sharply reduced chances of survival, compounding loss across generations. In this way, the danger of childbirth amplified childhood mortality and reinforced the pattern of early interruption seen throughout early human life. From an evolutionary perspective, these risks persisted because they were bound to fundamental aspects of human biology. The large human brain offered advantages in cognition, cooperation, and adaptability, but it came with a cost paid during reproduction. Natural selection favored brains that improved survival and reproduction overall, even if individual births were dangerous. As long as enough women survived long enough to reproduce, the system continued, despite the high individual cost. Social support could mitigate these risks but could not eliminate them. Experienced helpers, shared knowledge, and cooperative care likely improved outcomes in some cases, yet support had limits. Severe complications could not be resolved through care alone. Without surgical intervention, antibiotics, or blood replacement, many conditions remained fatal regardless of experience or effort. Pregnancy and childbirth thus remained among the most unpredictable and lethal phases of early human life. Understanding this risk reframes early human mortality once again. Lives were shortened not only by environmental hazards and energy instability, but by the biological act required to sustain the population itself. Reproduction was not a neutral process. It was a gamble, played repeatedly under harsh conditions. For many women, the cost of sustaining human life was the loss of their own. This reality shaped early human lifespans profoundly, embedding mortality into the very process that allowed the species to continue. Reproductive risk did not end with childbirth, but extended into the long period of repeated pregnancies that shaped much of early human adult life. Women in early human groups often experienced multiple pregnancies across their reproductive years, with little time for full recovery between them. Each pregnancy drew heavily on the body's energy, minerals, and immune capacity, especially calcium, iron, and fat reserves. In environments where nutrition was unstable, these resources were rarely fully replenished. Over time, the cumulative cost of reproduction weakened the body, increasing vulnerability to infection, injury, and exhaustion. Life expectancy shortened not because one pregnancy failed, but because many succeeded at a gradual cost to the mother's long-term health. This cumulative burden affected survival in subtle but powerful ways. A body that repeatedly diverted resources toward pregnancy and lactation had less capacity for repair and defense. Wounds healed more slowly, illnesses lingered longer, and fatigue accumulated more quickly. Even when childbirth itself did not result in death, the long-term consequences of reproductive strain could reduce resilience years later. A woman who survived several births might still face an elevated risk of dying from causes that a stronger body could have resisted. Reproduction thus acted as a slow pressure on lifespan, rather than a single point of danger. Lactation further extended this energetic demand. Producing milk required sustained caloric intake and hydration at levels difficult to maintain consistently. When food was scarce, the body faced difficult trade-offs between supporting the infant and preserving the mother's own health. These trade-offs were not consciously chosen, but physiologically enforced. Over time, prolonged lactation without adequate nutrition increased the likelihood of nutritional deficiencies, immune suppression, and physical decline. Survival continued, but at the expense of long-term durability. The timing of reproduction also mattered. Early human women often began reproducing soon after reaching maturity, when their own bodies were still completing growth and strengthening. Pregnancy during these years placed additional strain on developing systems, increasing risk during childbirth and recovery. Early onset of reproduction extended the total reproductive span, amplifying cumulative cost. This pattern again lowered average lifespan figures, not because individuals aged faster, but because the demands placed on the body began earlier and lasted longer. From a population perspective, this reproductive cost shaped survival patterns across generations. High female mortality during reproductive years reduced the number of individuals who could reach older age, skewing lifespan distributions. It also reinforced cycles of vulnerability, as children who lost their mothers faced reduced survival chances themselves. Reproductive risk therefore rippled outward, affecting not only individual lives but the structure of entire groups. Evolution did not eliminate these risks because they were inseparable from traits that made humans successful. Large brains required long development, prolonged care, and intensive maternal investment. These traits improved survival and adaptability at the species level, even as they increased individual cost. Natural selection favored the continuation of the system, not the protection of every participant. As long as enough women survived long enough to reproduce, the balance held. Seen in this light, reproduction was both the engine of human continuity and a major contributor to early mortality. It shortened lives quietly, through repetition rather than catastrophe. Early human women did not simply risk death at childbirth. They carried reproductive strain as a constant background condition. This strain limited how long many lives could be sustained, embedding mortality into the very process that allowed human populations to persist. Reproductive strain also shaped survival indirectly through its effects on social structure and daily risk, extending its influence beyond the female body alone. When pregnancy, childbirth, and prolonged recovery reduced a woman's mobility or strength, the distribution of labor within the group shifted. Others had to compensate, increasing their own exposure to danger through additional hunting, gathering, or travel. These adjustments kept groups functioning, but they redistributed risk rather than eliminating it. Survival was maintained through balance, and any prolonged imbalance increased the likelihood of loss somewhere else in the system. In this way, reproduction influenced mortality not only through direct biological cost, but through the cascading pressures it placed on collective survival. Repeated reproductive demands also limited the possibility of long, uninterrupted adult life. Even when women survived childbirth and recovered sufficiently to continue daily activity, the cycle soon began again. There were few long stretches of adulthood free from energetic strain. The body rarely entered a period devoted primarily to maintenance and repair. Instead, it oscillated between investment in reproduction and effort toward immediate survival. Over decades, this rhythm reduced the likelihood of reaching old age. Longevity requires not just survival through danger, but sustained intervals of stability, and those intervals were rare within reproductive life. This pattern helps explain why older women appear less frequently in early human remains than older men. While both sexes faced danger, women carried an additional recurring biological burden. Their lives were shaped by cycles that repeatedly placed them near the edge of resilience. Aging itself was not necessarily faster, but the accumulation of reproductive cost increased the probability that some other threat would eventually become fatal. Life expectancy shortened through probability rather than inevitability. Importantly, this does not suggest that early human reproduction was maladaptive. On the contrary, it was highly effective at sustaining populations under difficult conditions. High fertility compensated for high mortality, ensuring continuity despite loss. The system worked at the level of the species, even as it demanded sacrifice at the level of the individual. Early human societies persisted because enough women survived long enough to reproduce repeatedly, not because reproduction was safe or gentle. This perspective also clarifies why increases in human lifespan later in history were so closely tied to reductions in reproductive risk. Improvements in nutrition, sanitation, birth spacing, and medical intervention did not change the fundamental design of the human body, but they altered the conditions under which reproduction occurred. By reducing cumulative strain and lowering mortality during and after childbirth, these changes allowed more women to live beyond their reproductive years. Longevity expanded not because reproduction disappeared, but because its cost became manageable. Seen in the context of early human life, reproduction was not simply a life event, it was a long-term condition. It shaped daily energy balance, exposure to infection, physical resilience, and social dynamics. Its effects accumulated quietly, year after year, interacting with hunger, injury, and disease. Life ended early not because reproduction failed, but because it succeeded repeatedly under harsh conditions. Understanding this completes the picture of reproduction as a central force in early human mortality. It was not an isolated danger confined to childbirth, but a sustained pressure woven into adult life. The shortness of early human life was therefore inseparable from the very process that allowed humans to exist at all. Survival of the species depended on accepting individual loss, and reproduction was one of the clearest places where that trade-off became visible. Old age in early human life did not function as a protected stage, but as a fragile extension of survival that depended heavily on continued usefulness and environmental tolerance. There was no clear boundary at which a person became old and then entered a phase of safety or care. Aging unfolded gradually, and its risks accumulated quietly. As strength declined, reaction time slowed, and endurance weakened, daily tasks that once ensured survival became more difficult. Hunting, long-distance gathering, climbing, and carrying all demanded physical capacity that aging bodies could increasingly struggle to maintain. Unlike today, there were no systems designed to reduce these demands with age. Life did not adapt to the aging body was expected to adapt to life. This mismatch created a subtle but persistent danger. An older adult did not need to be severely frail to face elevated risk. Even small reductions in mobility or strength could increase exposure to injury, cold, or exhaustion. A slower pace meant longer time exposed to weather. Reduced grip strength made falls more likely. Diminished balance increased the chance that a minor slip would become a serious injury. Aging did not directly cause death, but it amplified vulnerability to the same hazards faced throughout life. In a setting where recovery was already uncertain, these amplified risks mattered greatly. Energy balance also became harder to maintain with age. Aging bodies require adequate nutrition to preserve muscle mass, immune function, and thermal regulation. Yet access to food still depended on effort and contribution. Older individuals who could not forage as effectively faced gradual depletion. Hunger interacted with aging by accelerating loss of strength and resilience, narrowing the margin for survival further. Even when groups valued and supported elders, resources were finite. Support could slow decline, but it could not eliminate the underlying constraints imposed by environment and energy availability. Social roles did provide some buffering. Elders carried knowledge, memory, and decision-making ability that could benefit the group. Experience in reading landscapes, predicting seasonal change, and mediating social tension held real value. These contributions could justify continued support even as physical capacity declined. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests that some early humans did reach advanced age, indicating that survival beyond physical prime was possible under favorable conditions. But this possibility remained conditional. Knowledge could not substitute indefinitely for physical survival needs, especially during periods of scarcity or movement. The absence of a protected old age also meant that decline could be abrupt. There was little gradual withdrawal from risk. A person might function adequately one year and then face lethal vulnerability the next after a minor injury or illness. Aging compressed the distance between independence and dependence carried danger. Once an individual could no longer keep pace with the group or protect themselves adequately, survival odds dropped sharply. This was not the result of cruelty, but of ecological reality. Groups themselves lived close to the edge, and their capacity to absorb long-term dependency was limited. From an evolutionary perspective, this pattern again reflects selection priorities. Survival beyond reproductive years had limited impact on gene transmission. While older individuals could contribute indirectly through knowledge and care, these benefits were secondary. There was no strong pressure to evolve mechanisms that guaranteed safe aging. The body aged in a way that was tolerable under constant risk, not in a way that ensured prolonged security. Understanding aging in this context reframes early human mortality once more. Lives were not shortened because bodies collapsed rapidly with age, but because aging occurred in an environment that offered no shelter from its consequences. Old age existed, but it was precarious. Longevity remained possible, but never guaranteed, and always dependent on the fragile alignment of health, group stability, and environmental fortune. As aging progressed, the relationship between the individual and the group became increasingly central to survival, yet it never removed risk entirely. Early human societies relied on cooperation, but cooperation itself was shaped by necessity rather than surplus. Older individuals could be supported when conditions allowed, but support was always contingent. Food had to be gathered, threats avoided, and movement maintained. When circumstances tightened, tolerance for long-term dependency narrowed. This meant that aging did not unfold within a stable safety net, but within a shifting balance between contribution and care. An older person might remain secure for years, then suddenly become vulnerable when the group faced scarcity, relocation, or conflict. Physical decline interacted with this social reality in subtle ways. Aging rarely rendered someone immediately helpless, but it reduced flexibility. Tasks that once required little effort demanded more time and energy. Reaction to sudden danger slowed. Endurance shortened. These changes did not exclude older individuals from daily life, but they increased the cost of participation. When energy expenditure rose without a matching increase in intake, decline accelerated. The body entered a feedback loop in which reduced capacity led to reduced contribution, which in turn increased vulnerability to hunger, exposure, and neglect. Survival depended not on a single failure, but on how long this loop could be delayed. Mobility played a crucial role in this process. Early human life was rarely static. Groups moved to follow resources, avoid depletion, or escape unfavorable conditions. For aging bodies, movement itself became hazardous. Long walks increased fatigue. Uneven terrain raised the risk of falls. Cold nights taxed weakened thermoregulation. An older individual could keep pace for years, then fall behind abruptly after illness or injury. Once pace was lost, danger increased sharply. Falling behind did not require abandonment to be fatal. Isolation alone increased exposure and reduced access to shared resources. Knowledge and experience could offset some of these risks, but not indefinitely. Elders contributed through memory, planning, and social cohesion. Their understanding of landscapes, weather patterns, and animal behavior could improve group survival. In some cases, this knowledge justified sustained care even as physical ability declined. Yet knowledge could not gather food, build shelter, or escape predators on its own. When survival demanded physical action, the limits of cognitive contribution became apparent. The balance between wisdom and weakness was delicate and easily disrupted. This dynamic helps explain why old age appears inconsistently in early human remains. Some individuals clearly lived into advanced age, showing long-term survival beyond physical prime. Others disappeared earlier, leaving no trace of prolonged aging. The difference was not biological destiny, but circumstance. Favorable environments, stable groups, and gradual decline allowed longevity to unfold. Instability, scarcity, or sudden health loss truncated it. Aging magnified the consequences of chance rather than determining outcomes on its own. From an evolutionary viewpoint, this variability again reflects selection priorities. There was no requirement for aging to be safe or predictable. As long as populations reproduced successfully, the fate of older individuals had limited impact on long-term genetic outcomes. Aging bodies carried value, but not protection. Longevity existed as an occasional extension of survival rather than a guaranteed phase of life. Understanding this social dimension of aging clarifies why early human life expectancy remained low even when individuals sometimes lived long lives. Old age was possible, but precarious. It depended on continued alignment between health, contribution, and environmental stability. When that alignment broke, survival could end quickly. Aging did not shorten life by itself, but it steadily increased dependence on conditions that were rarely secure. Old age ultimately exposed the limits of endurance in a life shaped by constant uncertainty, revealing how survival could persist for decades and then end abruptly without warning. Aging did not introduce new dangers so much as it removed the buffers that once allowed individuals to withstand familiar ones. Strength, balance, and speed declined gradually, but the environment did not soften in response. Cold nights remained cold, terrain remained uneven, and food still required effort to obtain. As these small declines accumulated, the cost of staying alive increased until it exceeded what the body and the group could sustain together. What made this stage of life especially fragile was the compression of risk. In earlier years, a setback could often be absorbed or compensated for through strength, recovery, or support. In later years, the same setback carried disproportionate consequences. A minor fall could limit mobility enough to prevent effective foraging. A brief illness could drain reserves that took too long to rebuild. A single missed migration or relocation could leave an older individual exposed to unfamiliar conditions. Aging reduced the margin between coping and collapse, making life increasingly sensitive to chance. This sensitivity explains why old age in early human life was often short once it began to assert itself. There was rarely a long period of gradual decline protected by stability. Instead, survival extended until a threshold was crossed, after which deterioration accelerated. Aging functioned less like a slow slope and more like a narrowing path. Each year passed reduced the number of possible futures. Longevity was not measured by years lived after decline began, but by how long decline could be postponed. Despite this fragility, the existence of elderly individuals remained significant. Their presence shows that early human life was not uniformly short or incapable of extended survival. Some individuals maintained health, usefulness, and support long enough to reach advanced age. These cases demonstrate that the human body did not lack the capacity for long life. What it lacked was a consistent environment that could sustain that capacity reliably across a population. This contrast between possibility and probability is central to understanding early human lifespan. Old age existed, but it was statistically rare because it required a continuous chain of favorable conditions. Each link in that chain had to hold adequate food, relative health, group stability, and the absence of disruptive events. Breaking any one link could end life quickly. In a world defined by fluctuation, such uninterrupted chains were uncommon. From a broader perspective, aging completed the pattern seen throughout early human life. Mortality clustered at points of vulnerability: infancy, injury, reproduction, and decline. Each stage shortened life not through biological failure, but through exposure to conditions that offered little protection. Old age simply concentrated these exposures into a final period when recovery was least available. By the time aging became decisive, survival had already been a long negotiation with risk. Lives were not short because humans aged rapidly, but because aging unfolded in an environment that never paused to accommodate it. Old age marked the point where endurance could no longer compensate for instability. Life ended not because the body was poorly designed, but because the world remained unforgiving until the very end. Male life in early human societies carried a distinctive pattern of risk that further compressed lifespan, especially after childhood had been survived. Young adult men often occupied the most dangerous position within the social and ecological system. They were expected to hunt large animals, patrol territory, confront rivals, and respond to threats quickly and forcefully. These roles increased access to food, status, and mating opportunities, but they also multiplied exposure to injury and death. Strength and speed improved short-term survival, yet they placed men repeatedly in situations where a single mistake could end life abruptly. Longevity was traded for immediate contribution, and the trade was enforced by circumstance rather than choice. In this context, physical peak did not represent safety, but heightened exposure to lethal outcomes. Competition between males intensified this risk. Disputes over mates, dominance, or reputation were not abstract social conflicts, but physical confrontations with real consequences. Without formalized conflict resolution, escalation was difficult to prevent once tension arose. Even when weapons were simple, their effects were decisive. Blunt force trauma, penetrating wounds, and head injuries were frequently fatal without medical intervention. A strong body offered little protection once violence crossed a threshold. As a result, many male lives ended not during decline, but during their years of greatest physical capability, further lowering average life expectancy. This pattern also interacted with group dynamics. Young men often acted as buffers between danger and the rest of the group. They absorbed risk that might otherwise reach women, children, or elders. From a group survival perspective, this made sense. Losing a young man was costly, but losing multiple dependents or caregivers could be catastrophic. Natural selection tolerated this imbalance because it preserved reproductive continuity at the population level, even as it shortened individual male lives. Mortality was distributed strategically, though unconsciously, across roles rather than evenly across ages. Risk-taking behavior amplified these outcomes. Hunting large or dangerous animals increased caloric return, but also increased the chance of fatal injury. Exploring unfamiliar territory opened new resources, but exposed individuals to ambush, falls, and isolation. These behaviors were not reckless in evolutionary terms. They were adaptive responses to scarcity and competition. However, adaptation at the group level did not translate into safety at the individual level. Many men survived repeated dangers, but probability ensured that some would not. The cumulative effect of these pressures meant that male mortality clustered in early and mid-adulthood. This skewed lifespan statistics and reinforced the appearance of universally short lives. Men who survived these years could sometimes reach older age, but reaching that point required not only strength and skill, but repeated luck. Each confrontation avoided, each hunt completed safely, and each rivalry resolved without violence extended life incrementally. Longevity became an outcome of avoided interruption rather than biological endurance. Importantly, this does not imply that early human societies were uniquely violent or dysfunctional. Similar patterns appear in many species where males compete for reproductive opportunity and group defense. Human intelligence and cooperation moderated violence, but they did not remove its structural role. The human social system balanced cooperation with competition, and male bodies bore much of the cost of that balance. Understanding male-specific risk clarifies another layer of early human mortality. Short life expectancy did not mean that bodies failed quickly across the board. It meant that certain roles carried disproportionate danger at precisely the ages when life might otherwise have extended far into the future. Early human life was short in part because survival demanded that some individuals repeatedly stand closest to violence. Knowing that strength increased exposure rather than protection, violence shortened early human life, not only through direct killing, but through the way it reorganized trust, movement, and cooperation over long stretches of time. When the possibility of conflict remained present, groups altered. By the time aging became decisive, survival had already been a long negotiation with risk. Lives were not short because humans aged rapidly, but because aging unfolded in an environment that never paused to accommodate it. Old age marked the point where endurance could no longer compensate for instability. Life ended not because the body was poorly designed, but because the world remained unforgiving until the very end. Male life in early human societies carried a distinctive pattern of risk that further compressed lifespan, especially after childhood had been survived. Young adult men often occupied the most dangerous position within the social and ecological system. They were expected to hunt large animals, patrol territory, confront rivals, and respond to threats quickly and forcefully. These roles increased access to food, status, and mating opportunities, but they also multiplied exposure to injury and death. Strength and speed improved short-term survival, yet they placed men repeatedly in situations where a single mistake could end life abruptly. Longevity was traded for immediate contribution, and the trade was enforced by circumstance rather than choice. In this context, physical peak did not represent safety, but heightened exposure to lethal outcomes. Competition between males intensified this risk. Disputes over mates, dominance, or reputation were not abstract social conflicts, but physical confrontations with real consequences. Without formalized conflict resolution, escalation was difficult to prevent once tension arose. Even when weapons were simple, their effects were decisive. Blunt force trauma, penetrating wounds, and head injuries were frequently fatal without medical intervention. A strong body offered little protection once violence crossed a threshold. As a result, many male lives ended not during decline, but during their years of greatest physical capability, further lowering average life expectancy. This pattern also interacted with group dynamics. Young men often acted as buffers between danger and the rest of the group. They absorbed risk that might otherwise reach women, children, or elders. From a group survival perspective, this made sense. Losing a young man was costly, but losing multiple dependents or caregivers could be catastrophic. Natural selection tolerated this imbalance because it preserved reproductive continuity at the population level, even as it shortened individual male lives. Mortality was distributed strategically, though unconsciously, across roles rather than evenly across ages. Risk-taking behavior amplified these outcomes. Hunting large or dangerous animals increased caloric return but also increased the chance of fatal injury. Exploring unfamiliar territory opened new resources, but exposed individuals to ambush, falls, and isolation. These behaviors were not reckless in evolutionary terms. They were adaptive responses to scarcity and competition. However, adaptation at the group level did not translate into safety at the individual level. Many men survived repeated dangers, but probability ensured that some would not. The cumulative effect of these pressures meant that male mortality clustered in early and mid-adulthood. This skewed lifespan statistics and reinforced the appearance of universally short lives. Men who survived these years could sometimes reach older age, but reaching that point required not only strength and skill, but repeated luck. Each confrontation avoided, each hunt completed safely, and each rivalry resolved without violence extended life incrementally. Longevity became an outcome of avoided interruption rather than biological endurance. Importantly, this does not imply that early human societies were uniquely violent or dysfunctional. Similar patterns appear in many species where males compete for reproductive opportunity and group defense. Human intelligence and cooperation moderated violence, but they did not remove its structural role. The human social system balanced cooperation with competition, and male bodies bore much of the cost of that balance. Understanding male-specific risk clarifies another layer of early human mortality. Short life expectancy did not mean that bodies failed quickly across the board. It meant that certain roles carried disproportionate danger at precisely the ages when life might otherwise have extended far into the future. Early human life was short in part because survival demanded that some individuals repeatedly stand closest to violence, knowing that strength increased exposure rather than protection. Violence shortened early human life not only through direct killing, but through the way it reorganized trust, movement, and cooperation over long stretches of time. When the possibility of conflict remained present, groups altered how they traveled, where they settled, and whom they trusted. Safer routes were not always the most resource-rich. Defensible locations were not always the most nourishing. Decisions were shaped by the need to avoid confrontation as much as by the need to survive ecologically. These adjustments reduced immediate risk, but they also carried long-term costs. Less optimal food sources weakened bodies. Restricted movement increased exposure to local scarcity. Social suspicion limited cooperation between groups that might otherwise have shared resources or knowledge. Violence thus shortened life not only by ending it abruptly, but by forcing lives into narrower, more constrained paths. The psychological weight of constant threat also mattered. Even without frequent fighting, vigilance demanded energy. Stress responses remained active, diverting resources away from growth, repair, and immune function. Fear altered sleep, attention, and social bonding, subtly eroding resilience over time. The body is designed to handle acute stress, but chronic threat shifts physiology into a state of long-term strain. In early human life, this strain did not announce itself as illness or injury, yet it quietly reduced tolerance to hunger, cold, and disease. Violence therefore acted as a background condition that made other dangers more lethal. This environment shaped social memory as well. Knowledge of past conflicts influenced present behavior. Stories of raids, betrayals, or losses guided decisions long after the events themselves had passed. These memories protected groups, but they also reinforced boundaries that limited interaction. Over generations, this produced fragmented human landscapes where cooperation was strongest within groups and weakest between them. Such fragmentation reduced collective resilience at larger scales. Groups survived locally, but population-wide stability remained fragile. Lives ended not because humans lacked intelligence or cooperation, but because cooperation rarely extended far enough to neutralize shared risk. Importantly, violence did not affect all individuals equally over time. Some lived their entire lives without direct confrontation, while others encountered it repeatedly. This uneven distribution made mortality unpredictable. A person could survive childhood, injury, hunger, and aging, only to die suddenly in an encounter unrelated to health or preparation. This randomness compressed lifespan statistics by inserting abrupt endings into lives that might otherwise have continued. Aging, experience, and caution reduced risk, but they could never eliminate it completely. From an evolutionary standpoint, this unpredictability was tolerated because it did not prevent population survival. Groups that managed violence well enough to reproduce persisted, even if individuals were lost along the way. Selection favored strategies that balanced aggression and restraint, not strategies that guaranteed personal safety. As a result, human social systems evolved to manage conflict, not to remove it. Mortality remained part of the cost. By the time violence is considered alongside hunger, injury, disease, reproduction, and aging, a consistent pattern emerges. Early human life was repeatedly exposed to forces that interrupted continuity. Violence was unique only in its speed. It could erase decades of survival in a moment, bypassing all gradual processes of decline. Longevity depends on time being allowed to pass. Violence denied that permission unpredictably. This completes the picture of why early human life was so short. Not because bodies failed quickly, but because life unfolded in a world where interruption was always possible, sometimes sudden and often unavoidable. Violence ensured that even the most resilient lives remained provisional, extending only as long as chance and circumstance allowed. Environmental instability formed a constant background force that shortened early human life by making survival dependent on conditions that could change faster than bodies or groups could adapt. Climate fluctuations altered landscapes across seasons and generations, shifting rainfall, temperature, vegetation, and animal movement in ways that directly affected food availability and shelter. Early humans did not live in a static world where successful strategies could be repeated indefinitely. A hunting ground that supported life one year could become barren the next. Rivers changed course, droughts arrived unexpectedly, and colder periods extended beyond familiar patterns. These changes did not need to be extreme to be lethal. Even moderate shifts could disrupt carefully balanced survival routines, forcing groups to move, adapt, or face scarcity. Life expectancy shortened not because environments were always harsh, but because they were unpredictable. Mobility was the primary response to environmental change, but mobility carried risk. Moving into unfamiliar territory exposed groups to unknown resources, new pathogens, different predators, and potential conflict with other humans. Each migration increased the chance of injury, separation, or failure to locate reliable food. While movement allowed survival in the short term, it prevented the accumulation of long-term security. Settling long enough to build durable shelters, establish reserves, or develop stable support structures was rarely possible. As a result, early human life remained provisional, continually adjusted rather than secured. Climate variability also interacted with all other mortality factors already present. Hunger intensified during poor seasons, weakening bodies and increasing susceptibility to disease. Injury became more dangerous when recovery time was shortened by the need to relocate. Reproductive risk increased when pregnancy and childbirth occurred under nutritional stress or exposure to cold. Aging bodies struggled more in unfamiliar or changing environments. Environmental instability did not act alone. It amplified every vulnerability simultaneously. Life ended not because one factor became overwhelming, but because multiple pressures converged under shifting conditions. Importantly, these changes were often gradual rather than dramatic. There were no clear signals announcing when an environment had crossed a threshold from survivable to dangerous. Decline could unfold quietly over months or years, eroding resilience until a final event triggered collapse. This gradualism made adaptation difficult. Strategies that had worked for years could fail without warning. Experience provided guidance, but it could not guarantee safety when the underlying patterns themselves changed. From an evolutionary perspective, this instability shaped human adaptability rather than human longevity. Selection favored flexibility, learning, and cooperation, traits that allowed survival across varied environments. Humans became generalists capable of living in many places, but this versatility came at the cost of reduced specialization and security. A generalist can survive many conditions, but rarely thrives long enough to eliminate risk entirely. Longevity requires predictability. Early human environments offered variation instead. Archaeological evidence reflects this instability indirectly through patterns of occupation and abandonment. Sites appear, disappear, and reappear over time, suggesting repeated movement rather than continuous settlement. These patterns point to lives spent adjusting rather than accumulating. Survival succeeded often enough to sustain populations, but not often enough to extend individual lives consistently. Environmental change ensured that even successful adaptations were temporary. Understanding the role of environmental instability reframes early human mortality once again. Lives were shortened not because humans failed to adapt, but because adaptation itself was an ongoing process rather than a completed state. Each generation faced conditions that differed from the last. Survival required constant recalibration, leaving little room for long-term bodily investment. In such a world, life expectancy reflected exposure to change rather than biological limitation. Early humans lived in motion, and motion, while enabling survival, kept life perpetually vulnerable to interruption. Environmental instability also disrupted the transmission of safety across generations, preventing hard-earned knowledge from fully stabilizing life. Early humans relied heavily on experience to reduce risk, learning where to find food, when to move, and how to avoid danger. This knowledge accumulated slowly and was shared through observation and memory rather than written record. When environments remained relatively stable, such learning could significantly improve survival. But when climate patterns shifted or landscapes transformed, much of that knowledge lost reliability. Familiar cues failed, seasonal expectations broke down. Strategies refined over decades could suddenly become ineffective. In these moments, experience offered less protection than expected, and life expectancy suffered accordingly. Survival returned to trial and error, a costly process when mistakes were fatal. This disruption was especially damaging because human life depends on continuity. Skills improve when conditions repeat. Bodies recover when stress follows predictable rhythms. Social systems stabilize when expectations hold. Environmental volatility broke these patterns repeatedly. A drought did not merely reduce food, it undermined trust in timing. An unexpected cold period did not only increase exposure, it invalidated prior preparation. Each disruption forced rapid adjustment under pressure, favoring immediate survival over long-term planning. Life shortened not because humans lacked intelligence, but because intelligence requires time and consistency to translate into safety. Children born into such instability faced additional disadvantage. Caregivers could not rely on familiar patterns to guide protection. Nutritional stress during key developmental periods weakened bodies before adulthood even began. Learning itself became riskier when environments changed faster than knowledge could be passed on. Each generation had to relearn survival under altered conditions, repeating losses that might have been avoided in a more predictable world. Longevity declined because improvement could not compound reliably across generations. Environmental change also strained cooperation between groups. When resources shifted, boundaries hardened. Groups competed more intensely for shrinking or relocated food sources. Cooperation that might have spread risk across wider networks became harder to sustain. Mobility increased encounters with unfamiliar groups under tense conditions, raising the likelihood of conflict. Thus, environmental instability indirectly increased violence, further compressing lifespan. The world grew not only less predictable, but more dangerous socially as well. Crucially, these pressures did not require extreme catastrophe. Even moderate but frequent changes were enough to destabilize life. A slightly shorter wet season, a delayed migration, or a gradual cooling trend could tip survival balances without dramatic collapse. This made danger harder to anticipate and harder to attribute. Lives ended through convergence rather than disaster, making mortality appear sudden even when causes accumulated quietly. From an evolutionary perspective, this volatility favored adaptability rather than endurance. Humans evolved to respond quickly, migrate readily, and adjust behavior flexibly. These traits ensured survival at the species level, but they did not guarantee long individual lives. Flexibility trades stability for responsiveness. It allows survival across change, but it does not eliminate the cost of change itself. Longevity requires an environment that allows repair, buffering, and accumulation. Environmental instability denied these conditions repeatedly. When viewed alongside hunger, injury, reproduction, violence, and aging, environmental change emerges as a unifying force that intensified every other risk. It destabilized food, increased movement, strained social bonds, and reduced the reliability of knowledge. Life expectancy shortened because survival remained provisional. Success in one period did not secure the next. Each life unfolded against shifting ground, where the rules of survival could change without warning. Understanding this completes another layer of the answer to why early human life was so short. Humans were capable learners and adaptable survivors, but they lived in a world that rarely stayed still long enough for adaptation to mature into safety. Life extended as long as adjustment kept pace with change. When change outran adjustment, interruption followed. Early human life was therefore brief, not because adaptation failed, but because it was never allowed to finish its work. Environmental instability ultimately placed a ceiling on how much security early humans could accumulate, no matter how skilled or adaptable they became. Each improvement in survival strategy existed only as long as the surrounding conditions remained compatible with it. When climates shifted, landscapes transformed, or resources relocated, stability reset. This prevented the gradual layering of safety that supports long life. Shelters remained temporary, food strategies remained provisional, and social arrangements remained flexible rather than fixed. Life unfolded as a sequence of adjustments rather than a settled trajectory. The body could endure hardship, but endurance alone could not create the long, uninterrupted spans required for longevity to become common. What made this instability especially limiting was its interaction with time. Longevity is not achieved by surviving danger once, but by surviving it repeatedly without accumulation of damage. Environmental change ensured that stress rarely followed predictable cycles. Recovery periods were cut short by new challenges. A season of abundance might restore strength, only to be followed by movement, cold, or scarcity before repair was complete. Over decades, this pattern prevented bodies from ever fully investing in long-term maintenance. Aging accelerated not because time passed faster, but because recovery repeatedly lagged behind exposure. This instability also shaped perception of the future. When conditions changed unpredictably, long-term planning lost reliability. Energy was invested in immediate survival rather than distant outcomes. Effort focused on today's shelter, today's food, today's safety. The future remained abstract and uncertain. This orientation made sense in context, but it limited the emergence of behaviors that protect long-term health. Longevity requires confidence that investment will pay off later. Early human life rarely offered that confidence. Environmental volatility further prevented the emergence of protected spaces. There were no consistently safe regions insulated from change. Even favorable environments carried hidden risks, from sudden drought to resource depletion. Movement offered escape, but it also exposed groups to new dangers. Staying put offered familiarity, but it increased vulnerability when conditions deteriorated. There was no permanent solution, only trade-offs. Life expectancy reflected this absence of refuge. Survival depended on constant negotiation rather than accumulation of safety. From a broader perspective, environmental instability ensured that mortality remained distributed across the lifespan. Childhood vulnerability, adult risk, reproductive strain, and aging decline were all intensified by changing conditions. No stage of life was insulated. Each depended on environmental alignment that could dissolve at any time. This universality of exposure prevented the concentration of death in any single phase and instead spread interruption throughout life. Average lifespan shortened because danger never receded long enough to allow life to unfold fully. Evolution responded by favoring adaptability over durability. Humans became capable of rapid learning, social coordination, and movement across diverse environments. These traits allowed survival across instability, but they did not remove instability itself. Adaptation became perpetual rather than cumulative. Each generation inherited the need to adjust rather than a stable platform to build upon. Longevity remained possible but exceptional, requiring extended runs of favorable conditions that were statistically rare. Seen in this light, environmental instability was not merely one factor among many, but a force that framed all others. It shaped hunger, intensified disease, increased injury risk, strained reproduction, amplified violence, and narrowed the margin for aging. Life expectancy was constrained not by biological limits, but by the absence of continuity. The human body carried the potential for long life, but that potential required a world that stayed still long enough to support it. This understanding brings the question of early human lifespan closer to resolution. Early humans did not die young because they failed to adapt. They died young because adaptation was never allowed to settle into safety. Life continued through motion, adjustment, and resilience, but rarely through stability. In such a world, survival was an achievement, but longevity remained a fragile exception, granted only when change paused long enough for life to breathe. Natural selection did not shape early human life around the goal of long survival, but around the goal of successful reproduction under unstable conditions. From an evolutionary perspective, the measure of success was not how long an individual lived, but whether they survived long enough to pass their genes to the next generation. Once that threshold was crossed, the force of selection weakened sharply. Traits that improved survival after reproduction provided limited advantage unless they also increased the survival of offspring. As a result, the human body evolved to be robust enough to reach adulthood and reproduce, but not necessarily to remain protected for decades afterward. Longevity existed as a byproduct rather than a target. This helps explain why so many factors that shortened early human life were never eliminated by evolution. High childhood mortality, dangerous childbirth, vulnerability to infection, injury, hunger, violence, and aging all persisted because they did not reliably prevent reproduction. Individuals often reproduced before these risks became decisive. A woman might give birth several times before dying in childbirth or from accumulated strain. A man might father children before being killed in conflict or by injury. From the standpoint of gene transmission, these lives were already successful. Evolution had no reason to remove the hazards that followed. The timing of human reproduction reinforced this pattern. Humans matured relatively early compared to the potential lifespan of the body. Reproduction occurred well before the body approached its biological limits. This created a long tail of life that existed beyond the core evolutionary requirement. Whether that tail was long or short depended largely on environment and chance, not on selection pressure. Bodies capable of lasting longer existed, but the system did not invest heavily in protecting that capacity. This evolutionary logic also clarifies why repair and maintenance systems in the human body are effective but not indefinite. Healing works well enough to restore function after injury or illness, but it does not guarantee perfect recovery. Immune defenses respond powerfully, but they do not eliminate all threats. Aging unfolds gradually, but without a mechanism to halt decline entirely. These systems evolved to support survival through reproductive years, not to ensure longevity beyond them. When environmental pressures accumulate, maintenance eventually falls behind damage. Importantly, this does not imply that early human life was expendable or insignificant. Evolution operates on populations, not moral values. Individual suffering or loss does not alter selection unless it affects reproduction. Early human societies could value elders, care for the injured, and support long lives, yet these cultural practices existed within biological constraints. Culture could soften risks, but it could not fully override evolutionary priorities without changes to the environment itself. This perspective reframes the question of why early human life was so short. The answer is not that humans were poorly designed, but that they were designed for a different success criterion. Survival was optimized up to reproduction, not beyond it. Longevity required conditions that reduced risk after reproduction, conditions that early human environments rarely provided. As long as danger remained high, selection had little leverage to favor long-lived individuals consistently. Over time, this created a species with latent potential for long life, but without a biological guarantee. Longevity became contingent rather than intrinsic. It appeared when chance, cooperation, and environment aligned, and disappeared when they did not. The human body could support long life, but it was not protected from the forces that cut life short once reproduction was complete. Understanding this evolutionary framing is crucial for interpreting early human lifespan honestly. Early humans did not fail to live long. They lived as long as evolution required under the conditions they faced. Anything beyond that was a fragile extension, not a promised outcome. Life expectancy reflected evolutionary sufficiency, not biological maximum. This distinction prepares the ground for examining how changes in environment, culture, and risk later allowed humans to move beyond this inherited limit and begin living lives that exceeded what evolution alone had ever demanded. The weakening of selection after reproduction created a wide space in which chance and environment determined how long early human lives continued. Once individuals had passed on their genes, survival became less visible to evolutionary forces. A person who lived 10 years beyond reproduction and one who lived 40 years beyond it contributed equally to genetic continuity. This meant that traits influencing late survival were only indirectly shaped, if at all. Longevity depended less on inherited protection and more on whether conditions happened to remain favorable. Early human life, therefore, extended into later years only when interruption was repeatedly avoided, not because biology actively defended those years. This explains why human bodies carry maintenance systems that slow decline but do not prevent it. Cellular repair, immune response, and metabolic regulation function effectively through early and middle adulthood, but they are not optimized for indefinite preservation. Damage accumulates slowly, and repair becomes less complete over time. Evolution tolerated this because the cost of perfect maintenance would have outweighed its reproductive benefit. Resources invested in extending life far beyond reproduction would have reduced energy available for growth, fertility, or early survival. The human body represents a compromise, balancing enough durability to reproduce with enough flexibility to endure uncertainty, but not enough protection to guarantee long life. Environmental pressures filled the gap left by weak selection. Where danger remained high, late-life survival was rare. Where danger temporarily receded, longevity appeared. This is why early human remains sometimes show individuals who lived long lives, even though the average remained low. These individuals were not the result of a different biology, but of a sequence of circumstances that allowed maintenance to keep pace with damage. They benefited from periods of adequate food, limited injury, reduced conflict, and stable social support. Their lives illustrate potential rather than norm. This contingent nature of longevity shaped human experience subtly. Older individuals existed, but they were exceptions rather than expectations. Societies did not organize life around the assumption of long old age because it was not reliably available. Cultural roles for elders developed where possible, but they remained adaptive responses rather than guaranteed life stages. Aging occurred without a promise of protection. Life extended until it could not, and no biological mechanism intervened to ensure continuation once conditions turned unfavorable. From a broader evolutionary lens, this pattern is consistent across many species. Lifespan tends to be longest where external mortality is low and shortest where it is high. Early humans lived in environments with high external risk. Predators, disease, injury, hunger, violence, and environmental change all acted as extrinsic forces that ended life regardless of internal condition. Under such circumstances, selection favors early reproduction and flexibility rather than late life defense. Human longevity remained plastic, sensitive to context rather than fixed by design. This perspective helps resolve the apparent contradiction between human biological potential and historical reality. The human body did not evolve to fail early, but it also did not evolve to guarantee longevity. It evolved to function well enough under uncertainty to reproduce and support offspring. Everything beyond that depended on reducing interruption. As long as interruption remained frequent, life expectancy remained low, even though the ceiling of possible lifespan was higher. Recognizing this clarifies why major increases in human lifespan occurred only when environments changed. Reductions in infection, injury, hunger, and violence lowered external mortality, allowing selection-neutral years to accumulate. Longevity emerged not through sudden biological transformation, but through the removal of forces that cut life short after reproduction. The latent potential already present in the human body finally had room to express itself. Seen in this way, early human life was short not because evolution neglected longevity, but because it had no reason to prioritize it under prevailing conditions. Long life was not selected against, it was simply unnecessary. Survival long enough to reproduce was sufficient. Everything beyond that belonged to chance. This understanding prepares the final step of the argument, where the focus shifts from evolutionary limits to the slow historical processes that finally allowed humans to live far beyond what evolution alone had ever required. The evolutionary framing of early human lifespan becomes complete. When we recognize that long life was never stabilized as a shared expectation, but remained an unstable extension beyond what biology required. Once reproduction succeeded, survival entered a zone where protection was inconsistent and largely unreinforced by selection. This meant that the human body carried no strong guarantee against late-life interruption. Repair mechanisms slowed damage, but they did not escalate in response to accumulating risk. Aging unfolded as a gradual loosening of control rather than a defended boundary. Life continued until conditions aligned against it, and when they did, there was no evolutionary safeguard to intervene. This helps explain why early human societies did not converge toward longer lifespans, even over vast stretches of time. Thousands of generations passed without a systematic increase in longevity because the pressures shaping survival remained the same. External mortality stayed high. Individuals continued to face hunger, injury, infection, violence, reproductive strain, environmental change, and aging without durable relief. As long as these forces remained active, selection had no leverage to favor traits that preserved life far beyond reproduction. The system was stable at the population level even if it was costly at the individual level. Importantly, this does not imply stagnation or failure. Early humans adapted successfully to an enormous range of environments and challenges. Their flexibility allowed the species to spread across continents and climates, but adaptability does not automatically produce longevity. It produces persistence. Human life extended just long enough to ensure continuity, not long enough to accumulate years without interruption. Longevity required not better bodies, but fewer disruptions. This distinction clarifies a frequent misunderstanding about evolution and aging. The human body did not evolve to age rapidly. It evolved to tolerate damage while prioritizing reproduction. Aging reflects the gradual accumulation of unresolved wear once maintenance no longer receives full investment. In early human life, this accumulation rarely reached its natural endpoint because external forces intervened first. Death arrived through interruption rather than exhaustion. The biological clock was often stopped before it could run down. The consequence of this was a wide gap between potential lifespan and realized lifespan. Human bodies could last longer, but most lives did not. This gap persisted because nothing in the environment consistently rewarded closing it. Individuals who happened to live longer did not leave more descendants simply by doing so. Without that feedback, longevity remained incidental. It appeared sporadically, disappeared easily, and never stabilized as a defining trait of the species. This understanding resolves the central question of early human life expectancy without resorting to weakness, primitiveness, or failure. Early humans did not live short lives because they were poorly equipped. They lived short lives because the conditions required to make long life reliable did not yet exist. Biology supplied capacity, environment determined outcome. Evolution remained largely neutral once reproduction was complete. By the end of this reasoning, early human life emerges as sufficient rather than deficient. It achieved what it needed to achieve under the circumstances it faced. Anything beyond that depended on reducing risk rather than improving design. Longevity waited not for new bodies, but for new conditions. This prepares the transition to the final stage of the argument. The question shifts from why early humans lived short lives to how humans eventually escaped that limit. The answer will not lie in sudden biological change, but in slow reductions of interruption through culture, cooperation, and environmental control. Only when life stopped being cut short did long life become common. Until then, evolution had already done its work, and chance decided the rest. The gradual lengthening of human life did not begin with stronger bodies, but with the slow reduction of interruption across daily existence. At some point in human history, survival stopped being a constant negotiation with immediate danger and began to include small pockets of predictability. This shift did not happen suddenly. and it did not happen everywhere at once. It emerged unevenly, through changes in behavior, cooperation, and environment that reduced how often lives were cut short. When fewer children died young, when injuries were less likely to become fatal, when hunger became less volatile, and when violence was more contained, time itself began to accumulate. Longevity did not appear as a new biological trait, but as a consequence of life finally being allowed to continue. These changes were modest at first. Slightly better shelters reduced exposure to cold. More reliable food strategies softened seasonal shortages. Shared care improved survival after injury or illness. Knowledge began to stabilize across generations as environments became more predictable. None of these changes eliminated risk, but each reduced its frequency or severity. Survival still required effort, but effort increasingly produced lasting benefit. For the first time, recovery could complete itself before the next challenge arrived. The body's existing capacity for repair finally had enough uninterrupted time to matter. This shift revealed something important about the human organism. The body had always contained the machinery needed for longer life. Muscles, bones, immune systems, and neural repair processes were capable of sustaining decades of function. What they lacked was not strength, but opportunity. When interruptions slowed, maintenance caught up, aging unfolded more gradually. Death arrived later, not because aging stopped, but because life was no longer repeatedly derailed before aging could run its course. Crucially, these improvements did not require perfect safety. They required only a reduction in volatility. Even modest decreases in early mortality transformed lifespan outcomes dramatically. When more children survived, average life expectancy rose. When fewer adults died from infection or injury, more individuals reached later years. Longevity expanded through accumulation, not transformation. Each avoided interruption added time, and over generations those additions compounded. This process also changed how humans related to the future. When survival became more predictable, long-term investment made sense. Effort could be directed toward building, teaching, and preserving, rather than merely enduring. Bodies benefited from this shift as much as societies did. Repair was no longer constantly postponed. Energy could be allocated toward maintenance rather than perpetual crisis response. Aging became something that unfolded within life, rather than being bypassed by early death. Importantly, this transition did not contradict evolution. It fulfilled what evolution had already prepared. Natural selection had produced bodies flexible enough to endure uncertainty and capable enough to last longer if given the chance. When environments finally reduced interruption, those capacities expressed themselves fully. Longevity emerged not because evolution changed its priorities, but because the conditions it operated within changed. Seen from this perspective, long human life is not a biological anomaly. It is the delayed expression of an old design finally placed in a safer world. Early humans did not fail to live long lives. They lived in a context that rarely permitted it. Once that context shifted, life extended naturally, without redesign. This reframes the entire story of human lifespan. The question is not why early humans lived such short lives, but why long life took so long to appear. The answer lies not in biology, but in the slow construction of conditions that allowed time to accumulate instead of being repeatedly taken away. Longevity arrived when interruption receded. Only then did the human body finally have room to do what it had always been capable of doing: persist. The reduction of interruption did not only extend individual lives, it changed the structure of human existence itself by allowing continuity to replace constant reset. When fewer lives were cut short unexpectedly, knowledge accumulated more reliably. Skills improved across generations instead of being relearned repeatedly. Children grew up with guidance from adults who had lived longer, and adults benefited from the presence of elders who carried memory beyond a single lifetime. This continuity created feedback loops that further reduced risk. Better knowledge led to safer behavior. Safer behavior reduced mortality, and reduced mortality allowed even more knowledge to persist. Longevity expanded not in isolation, but as part of a reinforcing system. As life became less volatile, the meaning of age shifted. Older individuals were no longer rare survivors of chance, but increasingly expected members of the community. Their presence reshaped social priorities. Care for the injured and the sick became more effective when groups had the time and stability to provide it. Practices that once offered marginal benefit began to compound over years. Simple hygiene, improved shelter placement, better timing of movement, and more deliberate conflict avoidance all reduced the frequency of fatal interruption. None of these changes altered human biology, yet together they transformed lifespan outcomes. This shift also changed how energy was used. When hunger became less unpredictable, bodies could invest more consistently in maintenance rather than emergency response. Repair processes completed themselves. Immune systems cleared infections more fully. Growth in childhood became more stable, producing stronger adults who entered life with greater reserves. Aging slowed not because damage stopped occurring, but because repair was no longer constantly postponed. Time, once fragmented by crisis, began to flow more smoothly. Importantly, this process was uneven and fragile. Gains in longevity could be reversed by environmental change, social collapse, or renewed violence. Long life was not guaranteed, it was conditional. But even conditional longevity marked a profound departure from earlier patterns. Each period of stability left traces in culture, technology, and behavior that could be rebuilt more quickly the next time conditions improved. Longevity began to reappear not as a rare accident, but as a recurring possibility. From an evolutionary standpoint, these changes did not require new selection pressures favoring long life. They altered the context in which existing biology operated. External mortality dropped, allowing selection-neutral years to accumulate. Lifespan increased without genetic redesign because the human body already possessed the capacity for extended survival. Evolution had prepared the tool. History provided the conditions. This reframes human aging as a dialogue between biology and environment rather than a fixed destiny. The same body that once lived short lives now lives long ones, not because it changed, but because the world around it did. Longevity is therefore not an evolutionary miracle, but a historical achievement built on reducing interruption. It rests on stability, cooperation, and predictability, more than on strength or endurance. Seen in this light, long human life carries an implicit lesson. It is not something the body demands, but something conditions permit. When those conditions erode, longevity contracts again. The capacity remains, but expression depends on context. Early human life was short because context was unstable. Modern human life is long because instability has been partially contained, not eliminated. This understanding leads naturally toward the final reflection of the story. Human lifespan is not a simple measure of biological progress. It is a record of how often life is allowed to continue without being cut short. The body has always been ready to last. Whether it does so depends on how well interruption is restrained. In this sense, longevity is less about defeating death and more about making space for life to keep going. The story of early human life reaches its quiet resolution when we recognize that longevity was never stolen from our species, but patiently waited for conditions that could support it. The human body did not suddenly learn how to live longer. It was always capable of doing so. What changed was the frequency with which life was interrupted before that capacity could unfold. Over time, humans slowly learned how to narrow the gap between survival and stability. Risks did not disappear, but they became less absolute. Death did not vanish, but it arrived later. This shift transformed lifespan not through biological reinvention, but through cumulative restraint of danger. When interruption diminished, life began to stretch outward in ways that altered human self-understanding. A longer life allowed memory to deepen, responsibility to extend, and identity to grow beyond immediate survival. Aging became a shared expectation rather than an exception. People began to imagine futures that extended decades ahead, not because optimism increased, but because experience made such futures plausible. The presence of older individuals changed how societies thought about time, care, and continuity. Life no longer ended as soon as it was established. It had room to mature. This transition carries an important lesson about the nature of human progress. longevity did not emerge from conquering nature or perfecting the body. It emerged from reducing how often life was cut short by preventable causes. Each avoided death added time. Each added span of time allowed repair, learning, and care to complete their work. Over generations, these small extensions accumulated into long lives. The body simply followed where conditions led. Seen from this perspective, early human life was not tragically brief, but appropriately matched to its context. Those lives were shaped by a world that demanded constant readiness for loss. Modern human life is shaped by a world that, while still dangerous, allows continuity more often than interruption. The difference lies not in worth, intelligence, or strength, but in stability. When stability increases, time accumulates. When time accumulates, life lengthens. This understanding also reframes how we think about aging today. Long life is not guaranteed by biology alone. It remains dependent on maintaining conditions that allow continuity. Hunger, violence, disease, environmental disruption, and social breakdown still shorten lives when they return. Longevity expands and contracts with context. The human body has not changed its basic design. It responds to the space it is given. The quiet truth at the center of this history is that life does not need to be made longer. It needs to be allowed to continue. Early humans lived short lives because continuation was constantly threatened. Modern humans live longer lives because those threats have been partially contained. The future of human lifespan will depend not on pushing the body beyond its limits, but on preserving the conditions that prevent life from being cut short. In this way, the question of early human life resolves into something broader and more enduring. The measure of a long life is not how much time the body can endure, but how much time the world permits it to have. Longevity is not a victory over death, but a pause in its interruptions. And that pause, fragile and reversible, remains one of humanity's most carefully constructed achievements. The story ends not with a conclusion, but with an open reflection. If human life lengthened when interruption receded, then the length of our future lives will depend on how well we continue to protect continuity itself. This is not a biological challenge, but a human one. Violence was not an occasional disruption in early human life, but a persistent background condition that quietly shortened many lives long before aging became relevant. Early humans lived in landscapes where resources were limited, territories overlapped, and misunderstandings could escalate without formal mechanisms for resolution. Conflict emerged not only between groups, but also within them, shaped by competition for food, mates, and status. Without centralized authority or stable enforcement, disputes were settled directly, often physically. Even when violence was not constant, its possibility influenced behavior every day, increasing stress, vigilance, and the likelihood of sudden death. Life could end not because the body failed, but because another human became the immediate threat. Intergroup conflict played a particularly important role. Neighboring groups competed for hunting grounds, water sources, and seasonal territories. Encounters were unpredictable and often tense. Archaeological evidence, including skeletal trauma and weapon injuries, suggests that violent death was not rare in many early human populations. Such encounters did not need to escalate into full-scale warfare to be lethal. A single ambush, raid, or retaliatory strike could abruptly end multiple lives. These deaths were sudden and irreversible, cutting lives short regardless of physical health or age. Within groups, violence also existed, though often in less visible forms. Competition for mates or influence could lead to physical confrontation, especially among young adult males. These confrontations increased mortality precisely in the age group that would otherwise have the highest survival potential. A strong body offered no protection against a weapon, and even unarmed conflict could result in fatal injury when medical care was absent. Broken bones, head trauma, and internal injuries were far more dangerous without treatment, turning fights that might be survivable today into fatal events in the past. The presence of violence shortened life expectancy not only through direct killing, but through its indirect effects. Constant threat increased injury risk, disrupted cooperation, and destabilized groups. Stress weakened immune function, while fear altered movement patterns, sometimes forcing groups into less favorable environments. Violence fractured social bonds, reducing the capacity for collective care during illness or injury. In this way, conflict multiplied the impact of other mortality factors already present in early human life. From an evolutionary perspective, violence persisted because it was entwined with survival strategies. Defending territory, deterring rivals, and protecting kin could increase reproductive success, even if it raised individual risk. Natural selection did not eliminate violent behavior because its benefits at the group or lineage level often outweighed its costs. The result was a species capable of cooperation and empathy, but also capable of lethal aggression under pressure. This duality shaped lifespan outcomes across early human history. Importantly, violence did not discriminate by age once individuals reached physical maturity. Young adults, who had survived childhood and were at peak strength, often faced the highest risk. This further lowered average lifespan figures by removing individuals who might otherwise have lived for many more years. Aging was bypassed entirely. Life ended not through gradual decline, but through immediate interruption. Understanding the role of violence helps complete the picture of why early human life was so short. Mortality was not confined to biological weakness or environmental hardship. It was also produced by social dynamics that introduced sudden, uncontrollable risk. Even in periods of relative abundance, violence could erase years of survival in a moment. Longevity requires predictability and safety. In early human life, other humans were often among the least predictable elements of all. Seen this way, violence functioned as another form of instability, compressing life by increasing the chance that survival would end abruptly. It ensured that even the strongest bodies and most experienced individuals could disappear without warning. Early human life was short not only because nature was unforgiving, but because human interaction itself carried lethal uncertainty.